Roofing is boring work most of the time. You strip, you patch, you nail, you go home. That's why I still think about the house in Coventry, because for one afternoon, it wasn't boring, and I've never told the story to anyone except my wife. It was the middle of May, 2021. I'd been booked by a woman named Marlene for a full tear-off and re-shingle on a Cape Cod-style house off Route 44. Nothing fancy, two-story, maybe built in the 1930s, one of those places where the driveway is longer than the front yard, and everything smells like old lilac in spring. She lived alone as far as I could tell. No cars in and out, no kids' toys in the grass, just her, and a screened porch with a wicker chair that had a book on the seat every time I glanced down. I was working solo that week. My usual guy, Ray, had thrown out his back on a job in Manchester, and Marlene wasn't in a rush, so I told her I'd knock it out over 3 or 4 days by myself. Small footprint, single story on the west wing, easy pitch, insurance was fine with it. The first day was normal. I got the dumpster set up in the drive, ran the ladder, started tearing off shingles on the south face. She came out once around 10 with coffee and a plate of shortbread cookies, said something polite about the weather, went back inside. That was it. I remember she wore a cardigan buttoned all the way up, even though it was 70 degrees out, and I was already down to my t-shirt. Second day is when it happened. I'd cleared most of the south side down to the deck, and I was working on a section over what I guessed was the original kitchen extension. The shingles came off easy, but underneath there were layers. Not 2, not 3. I counted 5 separate layers of tar paper and roofing felt, some of it so old it flaked apart in my hands like a dead moth. Somebody had been patching this roof over and over for decades, instead of doing it right. About halfway through the 3rd layer, my pry bar caught on something soft. I stopped and looked. There was a little dip in the sheathing there, no bigger than a saucer, and something tucked into it under the felt. I peeled the paper back with my fingers. It was a pouch, leather, about the size of a deck of cards, tied with a piece of dark string. The leather was greasy and dark from years of tar, but it hadn't rotted. Someone had wrapped it in a scrap of oilcloth first, and the oilcloth was what kept it dry. I sat back on my heels and just looked at it for a minute. The sun was hot on my neck. I could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the street and a dog barking at it, and behind that, nothing. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. Something inside shifted, little clicks, like dice in a cup. I untied the string. Inside were bones, small ones, 4 or 5, none bigger than my pinky nail. They were yellow-brown and smooth, and I honestly couldn't tell you what they were from. Not human, I don't think. I've seen deer bones and squirrel bones plenty of times growing up in Vermont, and these were more delicate than either. Bird, maybe, or something younger. Under the bones was a piece of paper, folded twice. It was thick, almost like parchment, and it had that soft brown color old paper gets when it's been shut away a long time. I could see writing through it, brown ink, but it was folded print side in. I didn't open it up there. I don't know why. Something about being alone on a R-off holding somebody else's private thing made me want another person around. I retied the string, climbed down the ladder, and walked around to the back door. Marlene was at the kitchen sink. She heard me on the porch steps and turned around before I even knocked. "I found something in the roof," I said. "I think you should see it." She dried her hands on a dish towel and came out. I held the pouch out on my flat palm. She didn't take it from me. She just looked at it, and her face did something I don't know how to describe. She didn't gasp or step back or any of that. She got very still, the way a deer gets still. Her eyes went to the pouch and stayed there. "Open it," she said, so I did. I untied the string and let the bones roll into my hand. I unfolded the paper enough that she could see there was writing, but I kept my thumb over most of it. I wasn't trying to be secretive. I just didn't feel like I should be the one reading it. She looked at it for a long time, maybe a full minute. The kitchen faucet was still running behind her, and she didn't move to shut it off. Then she said, "Put it back, please, exactly where it was." I opened my mouth to ask what it was, and she just shook her head once. Very small. She wasn't scared of me. She wasn't scared of the pouch, exactly. She was somewhere else, thinking about something I wasn't part of. I said, "You sure?" She said, "Please." So I climbed back up. I put the bones in. I folded the paper the way it had been folded, and while I was doing that, I glanced at it. Just a glance, because I'm a human being, and I wanted to know. I saw names, handwritten in a slanted script, one under the other like a list. Not many, maybe 6 or 7. Some had little dashes or numbers next to them. That's all I saw. She was watching me from the yard. I could feel her watching me from the yard. I tied the string. I set the pouch back in the dip in the sheathing. I laid the oilcloth back over it, put the layers of tar paper back the way they'd been, and covered the whole spot with new felt and new shingles. I did it careful, nailed clean. When I was done, you couldn't have told anything was under there unless you knew. I finished the rest of the roof over the next 2 days. She didn't come out with coffee again. On the last afternoon, she wrote me a check at the kitchen counter and slid it across to me. It was for twice what we'd agreed on. I started to say something, and she said, "I'd rather you didn't talk about the house to anyone, if that's all right." I said it was. I drove home to Willimantic that evening, and I told my wife I couldn't help it. She was making pasta, and I sat at the counter with a bear, and I told her the whole thing, the layers, the pouch, the bones, the paper. She stopped stirring. She said, "What did the names say?" And I told her I didn't read them. I got a glance. That's it. She was watching me, and I put it back. My wife looked at me for a second, and then went back to the sauce, and we didn't really talk about it again. That was almost 4 years ago. I still drive past that house sometimes when I'm out on a job in that part of the state. The roof I put on looks good. Marlene's car is usually there. The wicker chair is still on the porch. I don't wonder about the bones much. Bones are bones. People do strange things with animals, especially old people, especially in old houses in New England. But the names I think about. Not often, just sometimes when I'm driving alone late or when I can't sleep. I should have read them. That's the part I can't let go of, not what they were. Not who wrote them, just that I had them in my hand, unfolded, and I didn't look, and now I never will. The camp sits about 12 miles outside a town called Merrill, up in northern Wisconsin, and if you've never spent a winter up there, I can tell you the quiet is a real thing, not poetic, physical. You can hear your own coat rustle from the other side of a room. I took the caretaker job in October 2021 because I need something with a bed and no co-workers. My uncle knew the owner, a guy everyone just called Rick. Rick paid cash every 2 weeks, gave me a set of keys, and told me the season was done in September, but he wanted eyes on the property through spring. Kids' cabins, a mess hall, a boathouse on the lake, an old barn he'd converted into a chapel, 40-something acres in total. My job was to walk the grounds twice a day, make sure pipes didn't burst, and call him if anything looked off. The first month was nothing. I read a lot. I got into a routine where I did my morning walk around 8 and my night walk around 11, with the truck's headlights sweeping across the buildings on the drive back to the caretaker cabin. The first sign was on November 24th, day before Thanksgiving. I did my night walk, and the mess hall had a smell coming out of it. Not strong. Like somebody had cooked onions in there recently. I unlocked the door, and everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. Chairs stacked, kitchen clean. But the smell was there, hanging in the air like it had nowhere to go. I chalked it up to the vents, puling something in from outside. Deer carcass in the wads, maybe. I locked up and went to bed. 2 nights later, I saw the lights. I was doing my 11 o'clock walk, and from the ridge behind my cabin, you can see almost the whole camp laid out below. That night, 3 of the cabins on the west side had light in the windows. Soft light, like lanterns or shaded lamps, not overheads. I stood there for a minute counting to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Cabin 4, 6, and 7, definitely on. I got in my truck and drove down. Halfway there, the lights went out. Every one of them, not one at a time, all 3 at once. When I got to cabin 4, the door was locked. I unlocked it. The room was cold and empty, and the beds were made the way I'd made them a month ago. But there was a fresh boot print in the dust on the floorboards, wet at the edges. Someone had walked through there within the last few minutes. I did the whole loop. Every cabin locked, every cabin empty. I called Rick's cell 4 times that night and got voicemail every time. The next morning, I called him again from the mess hall phone. Voicemail. I left a long message about the lights and the boot print and asked him to call me back. He didn't. For about a week, nothing happened. Then, on December 3rd, I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of engines. I looked out my window, and there was a line of vehicles moving down the access road toward the main lodge. I counted 8 before I lost track. Pickups mostly, and one of those extended SUVs at the back. All of them killed their headlights before they passed the gate. I sat on my bed with the light off and watched for maybe an hour. People were unloading gear, coolers, duffel bags. One guy carried what looked like a folded cot over his shoulder. They moved quiet and organized, like people who had done this before. I want to say I called the police right then. I didn't. My first thought, honestly, was that Rick had rented the place out and forgotten to tell me. He was scattered like that, missed appointments, double-booked things. The next morning, I walked down to the main lodge. Nobody was there. But the ashes in the fireplace were still warm, and someone had swept the floor. Not just walked through it, actually swept it. The corners were cleaner than I'd left them. I found a man on the porch of cabin 6 about an hour later. He was maybe 50, gray beard, plaid jacket, sitting on the step drinking coffee out of a metal cup. He saw me coming and didn't get up, didn't look surprised. "Morning," he said. I said morning back. I asked him what he was doing on the property. He took a sip of his coffee and said, "We pay rent." That was it. That was the whole answer. He said it the way you'd tell somebody the time. I asked who he paid it to, and he just smiled and looked out at the trees. I asked him how many of them there were, and he said, "Enough." I told him I needed to talk to whoever was in charge, and he pointed at the lodge and said the guy I wanted was probably still asleep. Then he stood up, nodded at me polite, and walked inside cabin 6 and shut the door. I went back to my cabin and called Rick 11 times that day. No answer, no callback. I called my uncle, who told me Rick was probably out ice fishing, and to stop being nervous, that Rick rented the place all the time to church groups and hunting parties. My uncle actually laughed at me. By the next morning, they were gone. Every vehicle. I walked through all 4 cabins they'd used, and I couldn't find a single thing out of place. No trash, no hairs on the pillows. The beds were made tighter than I make my own bed. In the mess hall, the dish rack was dry. Somebody had wiped down the counters with something that smelled like vinegar. The only thing I found was a receipt in the trash can behind the lodge, a gas station in a town in Michigan. Paid in cash, no name. They came back 12 days later, December 15th. Same routine. Vehicles rolling in around 2 in the morning with the lights off. I counted this time, 410 vehicles. If you figure 2 per car on average, that's close to 30 people, maybe more. I stayed in my cabin. I locked the door, which I'd never done before, and I sat up with the lights off watching the road. Around 4 in the morning, somebody knocked on my door. 3 knocks, not hard, polite. I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. Whoever it was stood on the porch for maybe 10 seconds and then walked away. When I looked out the window, there was nobody there, just footprints in the snow going back toward the lodge. In the morning, I found a paper bag on my porch. Inside was a thermos of coffee, still warm, and a note that said, "Sorry to wake you, neighborly greeting, M." That was when I stopped telling myself it was a church group. I waited until they cleared out, which took another 2 nights, and then I got in my truck and drove to Rick's house. He lived in Wausau, about 40 minutes south. I'd been there once before to pick up a check. I knocked on the door. Rick answered in a bathrobe, holding a bowl of cereal. He looked at me like I was a Jehovah's Witness. I told him about the group, about the "we pay rent" line, about the note. He stared at me for a long time, and then he set the cereal bowl down on a table by the door and said, "I haven't rented that place to anybody. Not this year, not last year, not ever in the winter." He said it flat, the way you'd correct somebody who got your birthday wrong. We called the sheriff from his kitchen. 2 weeks later, the group came back and the sheriff was ready. I wasn't there for the arrest. I was told to stay in Wausau, and I sat on Rick's couch watching his TV with the sound off while it happened. There were 28 of them, all adults. Most had been living in vehicles or motels for months, moving through 5 states. A few were running from custody hearings. 2 had unpaid child support warrants big enough to get them jail time. One guy was wanted in Ohio for something a deputy later described to me only as old and serious. A woman in her 40s had been declared missing by her own family 6 years earlier and had been living under a different name the whole time. The man on the porch, the coffee guy, wasn't among them. He was never identified. I gave a description and looked through photos for 2 hours at the sheriff's office, and none of them was him. I finished out my contract until April. Rick offered me the job again for the next season. I told him I was moving to Minnesota, which was a lie. The thermos is still in a box in my mother's basement. I never opened it again after that first morning. I don't know why I kept it. I just did. The line I worked wasn't a crisis line. That was the first thing we had to say if someone came in wrong. If a caller was in actual danger, we transferred them to 988 and stayed on until the handoff. What we did was different and quieter. We just talked to old people who had nobody else to call. The center was on the 3rd floor of an office building off Nicollet, above a place that sold hearing aids and a tax preparer that only opened in spring. 6 cubicles. A fluorescent tube that flickered over Station 3 no matter how many times we asked maintenance. In February, the radiators clanked so loud we sometimes had to ask callers to repeat themselves. Coffee that tasted burnt by 10 p.m. because the pot had been on since noon. I worked the overnight shift, 10 to 6, 3 nights a week. The other 2 nights I was in nursing school. My shift partner was a retired social worker named Denise, who did crossword puzzles between calls and kept a bag of butterscotch on her desk. She's the one who trained me. The first thing she told me was, "You are not going to fix anyone. You just have to be there while they say something out loud." Most nights we got a handful of calls. Widows who couldn't sleep. A guy in Bloomington who called every Tuesday to talk about his model trains. A woman named Marlene who had a habit of dialing and then just breathing on the line for about 45 seconds before saying, "Well, I feel better now," and hanging up. That was the job. You didn't push, you didn't advise, you stayed on the line. The call came in on a Thursday, around 1 in the morning. It had been snowing since the afternoon, and the plows were doing that thing where you could hear them scraping down Nicollet every 20 minutes or so. The office was warm and dry and smelled like the wet wool of Denise's cardigan. I picked up on the second ring and did the greeting, and there was a small pause on the other end, the kind you get when someone dialed a number they weren't sure they were going to actually call. Then a man said, "Is this the number for people who just want to talk?" I said yes. He said his name was Walter. He said this was his first time calling. He apologized for that, which surprised me because people usually apologized for other things. Taking my time, being a bother, not this. His voice was level, that's what I remember most. Not shaky, not tearful. A voice like someone reading a page out loud, careful and clear. He said he was 80 and that he lived on the east side of St. Paul and that his wife had passed the previous January. 53 years. He said it like he was giving me a fact about the weather. I asked him about her. He said her name was Helen and that she had been a school librarian and that she was better than him at almost everything except driving. He laughed a little when he said the driving part. He told me about a trip they took to the North Shore in 1978 where the car broke down outside Two Harbors and they had to spend 2 nights in a motel with wallpaper the color of pea soup. He remembered the wallpaper. He remembered what she ordered at the diner, a patty melt with extra pickles. Then he told me about the war. He was in Korea, briefly, at the end of it, and he did not want to talk about specifics, and I did not ask. He only said that when he came home, he did not tell anyone what he had seen for about 30 years, and that Helen was the first person he told, sitting at their kitchen table, and she did not say anything for a long time, and then she got up and made him a grilled cheese sandwich. He said that was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for him. I said that sounded like a good marriage. He said it was. Then he told me about his daughter. Her name was Katie, and she lived in Portland, and she called on the first Sunday of every month, usually around 2 in the afternoon his time. He said she was a good person, and had 2 kids of her own, and a job that took a lot out of her. He said this without any edge, just describing the shape of a thing. He said, "I'm not calling because I'm upset. I want you to know that." I said, "Okay." There was a pause, long enough that I heard the radiator kick on, long enough that I checked the light on my phone to make sure the call was still active. Then he said, "I'm calling because today I realized there isn't anyone else." Another pause, and that's all right. I just wanted to say it to someone. I want to be honest about what happened in me right then, because it's the reason I remember this call and not the hundreds of others. I had a script in my head. Denise had drilled it into me. Reflect back, validate, do not rush. But I also had a clock. Average call length target was 20 minutes because we only had 2 people on overnight, and Cal's got dropped when both lines rang. I could feel the shape of the polite wind down forming in my mouth. "Is there anything else you want to talk about tonight, Walter? Thank you so much for calling." I did not say it. I asked him about the garden he had mentioned earlier, just a sentence he'd dropped in about tomatoes not doing well last summer. He talked about the garden for a while. He was one of those people who could tell you the exact year he put a lilac in and how tall it was now. He said Helen had wanted a peony bed and he had never gotten around to it, and he was thinking maybe this spring he would. He told me he had learned to bake bread from her after she got sick. He said the first 6 loaves were bricks. He said she laughed at every single one and ate a slice anyway, with butter and honey. He said now he made a loaf every Sunday and gave half of it to his neighbor across the hall, a woman named Rosa who was 70 and had a small dog. We talked for 40 minutes. Denise looked over once from her cubicle, and I shook my head slightly, and she nodded and turned back to her crossword. Before he hung up, I asked him if I could call him tomorrow, just to check in. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You're the first person who ever asked." I called him the next night. He picked up on the first ring, which told me something, though I didn't want to think about what. We talked for half an hour, mostly about the snow. I called him again the night after that. Over the next couple of weeks, I started making arrangements. Our center wasn't supposed to do this kind of thing, weren't caseworkers, but I knew a woman at a nonprofit in Ramsey County that ran a program called Visiting Neighbors, volunteers who came by once a week, groceries, conversation, a ride to the doctor if you needed one. I gave them Walter's name and address, with his permission. They said they had someone in his neighborhood. The volunteer wasn't me. That's not how the program worked. Once I made the referral, the file moved out of my hands. I finished nursing school that summer and left the hotline in August. I don't know what happened to Walter after that. I don't know if the volunteer worked out. I don't know if he made his peony bed. I don't know if his daughter still calls on Sundays, or if she calls more now, or less. I could probably find out. I never have. Some nights, working the floor at the hospital, I think about that pause on the line, the one right before he said there wasn't anyone else. It wasn't a sad pause. That's the part that stays with me. It was the pause of a man who had already decided the sentence was true and was just working out whether to say it out loud. I hope he made the bread that Sunday. I hope Rosa got her half.